Imagine a man, a mass murderer, a ghost walking through the crowded streets of an American city in broad daylight. He does not wear a disguise. He does not hide in the shadows. He walks with the supreme confidence of a king. For 20 years, this predator hunted his rivals, extorted businesses, and flooded the neighborhoods of Boston with narcotics. Law enforcement agencies across the country spent millions trying to catch him. The state police chased his shadow. The Drug Enforcement Administration tapped his phones. Yet, every single time the net was about to close, the trap was mysteriously empty. The ghost had vanished. How does a monster survive for 2 decades under the intense scrutiny of the American justice system? The answer is not that he was a genius of evasion. The chilling truth is far more sinister. He was not hiding from the government. He was hiding behind it. He was protected by an invisible, impenetrable shield, forged by the most elite law enforcement agency in the world, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Welcome to Shadow Dossier. Today, we are opening a classified vault that the United States government desperately tried to keep sealed forever. This is not just a story about a corrupted cop. This is the anatomy of the ultimate betrayal, a tragic epic of a federal agent who sold his soul, compromised national security, and handed the keys of a city to a psychopath. This is the dark, blood-stained pact between FBI agent John Connolly and the undisputed king of the Boston underworld, James Whitey Bulger. To understand how this nightmare began, we have to travel back to the gritty, unforgiving streets of South Boston in the 1970s. The United States Department of Justice was fighting a massive, desperate war. Their primary target was not the Irish gangs of Southie, it was the Italian Mafia, La Cosa Nostra. The FBI directors in Washington issued a mandate that echoed through every field office in the country: destroy the Mafia at any cost. This singular, blinding obsession created a dangerous vulnerability. Agents were pressured, promoted, and praised, based entirely on their ability to recruit high-level informants within the criminal underworld. Enter John Connolly. He was a rising star in the FBI, a charismatic, ambitious agent who knew the streets of Boston better than anyone because he was born on them. Connolly grew up in the old harbor housing projects of South Boston. He shared the same concrete playgrounds, the same tribal loyalties, and the same unwritten codes of silence as the criminals he was sworn to lock up. And in Southie, no figure loomed larger than James Whitey Bulger. Bulger was a ruthless enforcer, a cunning strategist, and a man who ruled through absolute terror. He was the boss of the Winter Hill Gang, an Irish mob syndicate that was steadily expanding its empire. But Bulger had a problem. The Italian Mafia was encroaching on his territory. The traditional enemies of his syndicate were becoming too powerful. John Connolly saw an opportunity that would define his career and ultimately destroy his life. He arranged a secret meeting with Bulger on a freezing night in a dark, empty parking lot. The proposition was simple, yet utterly devastating in its consequences. Connolly offered Bulger a golden ticket. He asked Bulger to become a top echelon informant for the FBI. The deal was framed as a strategic alliance. Bulger would feed the FBI information about the Italian Mafia, his rivals. In exchange, Connolly promised that the FBI would look the other way regarding Bulger's own criminal enterprises. It was a pact signed in the dark, a handshake that would soon be drenched in blood. Connolly returned to the Boston field office as a hero. He convinced his superiors that he had landed the ultimate asset. The FBI brass, blinded by their desperation to take down the Italians, ignored all the red flags. They authorized the operation. They officially designated a homicidal maniac as an asset of the United States government. But here's the most terrifying plot twist in this entire saga. John Connolly genuinely believed he was the puppet master. He thought he was using a criminal to achieve justice. He was dead wrong. James Whitey Bulger was a master manipulator, a sociopath with an unparalleled genius for reading human weakness. Bulger immediately recognized the fatal flaw in Connolly. It was hubris. It was arrogance. It was the blind ambition of a federal agent who wanted to be a legend. Bulger did not work for the FBI. He weaponized the FBI. From the moment that pact was sealed, the power dynamic inverted completely. Bulger began feeding Connolly low-level, often useless intelligence about the Italian Mafia, just enough to keep Connolly's bosses happy, just enough to ensure Connolly received medals and commendations. But behind the scenes, Bulger was using his new status as an FBI informant to annihilate his competition. If a rival gang threatened Bulger, he did not have to shoot them. He simply whispered their names to John Connolly, and the FBI would dismantle them. Bulger effectively transformed the Federal Bureau of Investigation into his personal assassination squad and private security firm. The Winter Hill Gang began to operate with total impunity. Extortion rackets multiplied. Drug trafficking operations expanded without interference. Whenever local police departments or other federal agencies got close to building a case against Bulger, Connolly would intercept the intelligence. He would sabotage the investigations from the inside. He leaked the locations of wiretaps. He destroyed evidence. He protected his asset with a fanatical devotion that defied all logic and law. The people of Boston were living in a war zone, completely unaware that the architect of their suffering was being shielded by the very men sworn to protect them. The FBI had created a monster they could no longer control, and John Connolly, the golden boy of the Bureau, had crossed a point of no return. He was no longer a law enforcement officer. He was a co-conspirator in a massive, ongoing criminal enterprise. He had traded his badge for the blood-soaked loyalty of South Boston. But the worst was yet to come. The protective shield provided by the FBI was about to evolve into something far more horrifying. It was about to become a license to kill. And John Connolly was about to hand over the names of innocent people to a man who would gladly pull the trigger. The 1980s descended upon Boston like a dark, suffocating fog. The Winter Hill Gang, under James Whitey Bulger, reached the absolute zenith of its terrifying power. This was no longer just a local crew running illegal gambling and small-time shakedowns. This was a sophisticated, multi-million-dollar criminal empire built on a foundation of extreme violence and absolute control. Bulger flooded the neighborhoods with cocaine and marijuana. He extorted every legitimate business that crossed his path. He ruled the streets not just with fear, but with an unparalleled intelligence network. An intelligence network that was secretly, illegally funded and maintained by the United States government. The paradox was sickening. The man flooding the streets with poison was the very man the FBI was protecting as their most valuable asset. Law enforcement agencies outside of the FBI were not completely blind to what was happening. The Drug Enforcement Administration, the Massachusetts State Police, and local detectives were desperately trying to build cases against Bulger. They launched massive, multi-agency task forces. They deployed surveillance teams around the clock. They secured court orders for wiretaps on Bulger's known hangouts and telephone lines. But every single time they prepared to strike, they found themselves swinging at a ghost. Their targets were always one step ahead. Their wiretaps suddenly went dead. Their key witnesses abruptly stopped talking or vanished entirely. The frustration within the DEA and the state police reached a boiling point. They could not understand how a local gangster could possess such flawless, real-time counterintelligence. They did not know that the traitor was sitting in the federal building, right down the street. John Connolly was the leak. He was the ultimate inside man. Whenever another agency briefed the FBI on their progress against Bulger, Connolly would immediately rush to a payphone. He would contact Bulger and detail every aspect of the impending raid. He revealed the locations of hidden cameras. He warned Bulger about which of his associates were being targeted for interrogation. Connolly was aggressively sabotaging federal and state investigations to protect his informant. He justified this treason to himself by claiming that Bulger's intelligence on the Italian Mafia was too valuable to lose. But the reality was far darker. Connolly had become addicted to the power, the prestige, and the illicit financial rewards that came from his unholy alliance with the king of the underworld. He was receiving envelopes stuffed with cash, expensive gifts, and a lifestyle that far exceeded an FBI agent's salary. He was no longer handling an informant. He was a fully initiated member of the Winter Hill Gang. The corruption soon crossed the ultimate line. It escalated from obstruction of justice to cold-blooded murder. The shield of protection became a weapon of execution. In the early 1980s, a low-level criminal named Brian Halloran approached the FBI. He was terrified. He offered to testify that Bulger was responsible for a gruesome mob hit. Halloran was seeking entry into the witness protection program. He believed the FBI would save his life. It was a fatal miscalculation. Within hours of Halloran making his statement, John Connolly illegally accessed the highly classified files. He discovered Halloran's identity and his location. He immediately relayed this top-secret information directly to James Whitey Bulger. Connolly knew exactly what Bulger would do with that information. He handed Bulger a death warrant. Shortly after, as Halloran was leaving a restaurant on the waterfront, a car pulled up. Bulger himself, wearing a disguise, leaned out the window with a suppressed machine gun and unleashed a hail of bullets. Halloran and an innocent bystander were slaughtered in the street. The FBI had literally served a witness to his executioner. The bloodshed did not stop there. A few years later, a man named John McIntyre began cooperating with customs officials regarding a massive weapons smuggling operation orchestrated by Bulger for the Irish Republican Army. Once again, the intelligence made its way to the Boston FBI office. Once again, John Connolly accessed the files, and once again, he whispered a name into the ear of a psychopath. John McIntyre was lured to a basement in South Boston. He was chained to a chair, interrogated for hours, and then brutally strangled to death by Bulger. His teeth were pulled out to prevent identification, and his body was buried in a secret, makeshift graveyard. Another life extinguished because an FBI agent decided to play God. While the bodies of informants and rivals were piling up in shallow graves across Massachusetts, what was happening inside the halls of power in Washington? The silence was deafening. The systemic blindness of the Federal Bureau of Investigation is perhaps the most horrifying aspect of this entire dossier. Connolly's supervisors were not fools. They saw the impossibly high success rate of Bulger's crew. They heard the desperate complaints from the state police about a massive leak, yet they chose to look the other way. They were completely blinded by their own bureaucratic ambitions. Connolly was delivering the heads of the Italian Mafia bosses on a silver platter, and that was all that mattered to headquarters. They gave Connolly glowing performance reviews. They awarded him the highest commendations the Bureau had to offer. They celebrated a man who was actively participating in serial murder. The institutional rot was complete. The FBI had sold its soul to win a turf war, and the citizens of Boston paid the price in blood. The fortress of lies could not hold forever. By the early 1990s, the cracks in the foundation of the Boston FBI office began to show. Dedicated local investigators from the state police and the Drug Enforcement Administration refused to let the ghost disappear again. They launched a clandestine operation, hiding their progress not just from the underworld, but from the Federal Bureau of Investigation itself. At the same time, relentless investigative journalists from the Boston Globe started piecing together the horrifying puzzle. The whispers on the streets of Southie were finally making their way onto the front pages. The public began to ask the terrifying question: was Whitey Bulger an informant, or was he the boss of the FBI? The pressure from the United States Department of Justice finally broke through the corrupt shield. In the winter of 1994, a massive, airtight federal indictment was drafted against Bulger and his inner circle. This time, there was no escaping the law. Or so they thought. John Connolly had retired from the Bureau, but his dark loyalty to South Boston remained unbroken. He still had sources inside the federal building. When Connolly learned that the trap was finally set, he committed his ultimate act of treason against the United States. He picked up the phone. He called his old friend. He warned Bulger that the indictments were coming down and that the arrests were imminent. Under the cover of darkness, James Whitey Bulger packed his bags, took his hidden millions, and vanished into the wind. He transformed from a protected asset into the most wanted fugitive in America, second only to Osama bin Laden. For 16 agonizing years, the families of his victims watched in horror. The man who murdered their sons and brothers lived a life of freedom, fully funded by the criminal empire the FBI helped him build. The fallout was apocalyptic. The United States Congress convened special hearings to investigate the worst corruption scandal in the history of federal law enforcement. The truth was dragged into the light, and it was uglier than anyone could have imagined. John Connolly, the Golden Boy, the legendary agent who brought down the Mafia, was arrested in handcuffs. He was stripped of his badge, his dignity, and his freedom. He was put on trial not just for racketeering and obstruction of justice, but for murder. The court found that his deliberate leaks of classified information directly caused the assassinations of John McIntyre and Brian Halloran. Connolly was convicted of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a maximum security prison. The psychological climax of this tragedy is a bitter, sickening paradox. The decorated federal agent rotted in a steel cage, entirely destroyed by his own blind ambition and toxic loyalty. Meanwhile, the ruthless psychopath he had sacrificed everything to protect was out there, living out his days in the sunshine, laughing at the system he had so perfectly manipulated. Who was the real puppet master? Was it the monster who pulled the trigger, or the badge-wearing official who handed him the gun and looked the other way? This dossier proves that when the government decides to dance with the devil to achieve its goals, the devil always leads. The blind pursuit of justice, without morality, creates the very monsters it seeks to destroy. If this dark journey into the corrupted heart of the system opened your eyes, then you belong here. We will continue to rip the black bars off the most guarded files in history. Do not let the truth get buried again. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and prepare yourself for the next Shadow Dossier. The secrets are waiting.